Hi, Edwin. Good to see you again.
Good to be here again, Aram.
So today's guest is Edwin Clamp, his second appearance on this show. And Edwin just read a paper about mapping meaning. And honestly, Edwin, you kind of played right into the hands of the Coherent Business Podcast, because it's basically in this paper describing how meaning works, how coherence is created, how it falls apart, and some different conceptual frameworks for getting a handle on that. But I think before we get started, we should,
Oh,
open up
yes.
here.
Let's do that.
You have to open it quick to make sure your widget. Oh, your widget broke open.
All right. And I obviously suck at point beer, but that's okay.
Well, so with the widget, you're supposed to let it sit for 30 seconds so it bubbles through and starts to calm down,
Okay.
and then you pour it.
That's why you're the beer expert. I'm just the consumer in this equation.
Well, Guinness is a good beer for a podcast because it's 4.2%.
There you go. And it's sippable. Cheers, Aram.
Cheers.
So another good conversation.
So I wanted to start with a quote from your paper. Thought it'd be a good jumping off point. And that is, a concept is not just a point. It sits in a network of relations. It has neighbors, opposites, extensions, emotional tones, metaphorical bridges, and practical consequences. Where many such relations are taken together, they form something more than a cluster of facts. They form a landscape. So what is a landscape of concepts?
Well, I think primarily it's a metaphor that allows us to grasp some feature of how our mind works. So we're tapping into a metaphor of the landscape. But the way I got to that metaphor was through looking at how human beings think. And just as you would, for example, if we were designing an airplane, we would test that airplane in a wind tunnel. So we're looking at a simulation basically to figure out how something works. We've come to the point in society where we're at this really interesting place that AI and large language models are essentially brain simulations. Now, we're not talking exactly, but roughly they simulate how the human brain works. That's why they were built the way they've been built. And when you look at that, it's taking place in what we would call like a high dimensional space. We don't need to go into that because it gets very abstract.
Although I do want to go to the one image you had in the paper. We'll describe that at some point.
But I mean, if we take those high dimensions and we just collapse them down to a three-dimensional space that we are familiar with, when you map meaning into these large language models, what you would see is they would start to form shapes. In my paper, we talk about manifolds, which is the scientific term for like a shape in a space.
And specifically transition between different basins or different topographies.
Yes. So what you start to see is, imagine a topographical map.
Sure.
That's essentially an abstraction of how information is organized in these high dimensional spaces. We're simplifying it. But it creates a landscape. And I think the poignant part about that is, think about a raindrop. Let's say we got a raindrop. I mean, we can go fairly close to here when we get to the Eastern Continental Divide. That raindrop falls on a mountain ridge. Where does it go? It's either going to go down into the Potomac Basin, where we live. This whole region is drained by that main river. Or it'll go into the New River, or it could go, I guess there are other places depending on where the raindrop falls. But what that really is saying is that there is a probability that that little drop of water is going to follow this very specific path. It's a probabilistic model. Landscapes are probabilistic. The paths that are the most probable tend to be the most deeply worn. So think of the Grand Canyon. That's where probabilistically the water's going to flow.
So would it be accurate to say an example of this would be, say, my political beliefs? In theory, the thoughts that go through my head are indeterminate, but in actual fact, they tend to get attracted down into one of these basins, into some river, and that river ends up, first of all, far away from where the initial impulse would have been, but also probabilistically it's determined that I don't just end up with a random collection of ideas. I end up with something that is in my landscape attractive to me.
Yes. So, I mean, look at what we've got going on in the world. I was just having beer with a friend of mine from Europe, and we were talking about, geopolitics. I was kind of surprised on his take on geopolitics, but it makes sense in this model. He is, his thinking, his worldview which we can say the worldview is the map of the landscape that we inhabit, right? It's how we make sense of our surroundings.
You could describe a worldview as a meaning topography.
Yes, exactly. So here he is. He's basically rooted in a European worldview, which is informed by European media and European educational institutions and traditions. And he had same facts, quote unquote. His interpretation of those were very, very different than my interpretation. Because whatever little drops of facts are falling from the sky, his worldview will funnel those probabilistically into the most likely interpretation. All right. Now, we can see this domestically. We have a very vibrant domestic situation, politics, but we have people who are essentially inhabiting different landscapes of meaning because the same facts are interpreted in completely different ways.
So you talk some about sort of the crisis that we're going through or the crises that we're going through, and you describe it as sort of a failure of the maps. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think we're at this point, and I kind of bring this up in the paper here. Our current worldview is described as the Cartesian-Newtonian worldview. Rene Descartes, I think therefore I am, but he also gave us a philosophical position, but he also gave us the Cartesian coordinate system, which maps space, XYZ axis, right?
And creates certainty in things that are uncertain and indeterminate.
Yes. So, I mean, just mapping, it was a profound innovation in thought.
And 500 years later, we have nuclear war.
Yes. But along with that is Cartesian-Newtonian. We got Newtonian physics, which allows us to basically simulate how things move in those 3D spaces. Missiles, whatever, planes. Those two ideas have literally given birth to our civilization. Those are mapping ideas.
Definitely like first and second industrial revolution phases.
Yes.
They're based in this worldview. And those worldviews work very, very well within this narrowly prescribed set of geometry or scaling
Yes.
that they deal with.
So our current worldview really is in those dimensions. We have a certain degree of mastery of that kind of mechanistic universe. Like we have planes, we have space rockets, we have, geoengineering, we have all of this stuff that comes out of that body of thought. Okay. What we don't have very well is a idea of the landscape of thought. Currently, I mean, we look at our current situation where our culture is interfacing with the Iranian culture in this war, and they're clearly like deeply ideologically driven positions, but really we don't have much of an understanding of that. And to the extent that we have an understanding, it tends to be framed in an adversarial way. What I'm suggesting with this kind of metaphor is thought creates landscapes. And once we have the mechanism by which we can map the landscape, then we can basically have a similar trajectory of enlightenment where we're now navigating those landscapes instead of running roughshod over them,
Where does the crisis come in? Is it because we are trying to apply Cartesian-Newtonian tools to a much more complex landscape of thought and meaning? Or are you talking about something that's happening within the landscape of thought and meaning that is kind of leading to this sense of rupture or impending doom, depending who you're talking to?
Well, I think the crisis comes in that we've built this, I say this in quotes, we built a rational world. So we used to talk about like international order and norms-based geopolitics and the rule of law. And we can see in the last couple years, a lot of that kind of logically grounded thinking has gone out the window.
Can you say a little bit about logical versus rational? I mean, there's a lot of definitions there, but when you say that this is logical, the international rules-based order or capitalism or, whatever it is this logical? Is it rational? And how would you structure those definitions?
This is where we kind of run into some of the constraints of words, but rational and logic, I'm going to kind of put those in the same bag. It's generally, we're looking at the world and we're saying, well, this is how the world works.
We have a map, we have a topography.
Yes, the world, like, for example, we're talking about economics. We have economic theories that are very mechanistic. You inject liquidity into the economy and then this happens. It's very much, if you take the Newtonian physics, like we fire the missile and we can calculate exactly where it lands. We have a similar mindset with economics, like, well, we do this and this happens, right? So we have this logical model, and that works really well while the environment stays the same.
So basically, if I have a map and it says walk 3 miles northeast and you're going to come to a cliff, you climb the cliff and you're at the top, right?
Mhm.
Like that works until the landscape starts to move. And
Right.
so if I say something like, if your fiscal policy has deficit spending, then over time interest rates are going to rise.
Mhm.
Then, that has some meaning within a certain system, within a certain topography. And if the topography changes, then, well, your model is, no matter how rational, no matter how great it is, it's toast.
Right. So what we have is this kind of everything is predicated on this idea that our environment is relatively predictable, and therefore our map, as it were, is essentially going to get us to where we want it to go.
Sure.
I think we just stay with the economics. We had pretty functional economic theory for quite a while. But now we've gotten to this place where our economic theories are starting to break down. Okay, what happens if, we go into another financial crisis? We've kind of maxed out where we can go with quantitative easing. We don't have good new mechanisms. So it's almost like if we take this certainty that we get with classical physics, like we've designed this plane and it's going to fly, that plane does great until it starts to get to the edge of space where the rules change. And then all of a sudden,
Or if you build an atomic level plane, it doesn't fly.
right. And so we've gotten to this place in our society where I think we had a pretty good shared understanding of things. Everybody's got a little bit of a different take, but it's like, if I steal a car, I understand I'm going to go to prison. Okay. We had a good shared map and everybody was able to navigate functionally. But all of a sudden, we're at this place in our society where things are not following the same rules. We've got people in the Department of Justice and the FBI acting in ways that break the rules. Okay. Our map doesn't help us address that. There's no get off on this exit when you see this happening. We're like, what in the world's happening? So we're at this place where our map, you can call it our social agreement, isn't really functioning very well. And it's like, if you look at the pictures of Gaza, there's a point where the breakdown in the environment gets so extreme, the map becomes more confusing because you're like, well, there's supposed to be like a school over here, and I can't tell if there was a school there anymore.
To extend the analogy, there can be a breakdown in physical structures and physical environments that is a direct result of a breakdown in a meaning structure or an information environment.
Yeah.
And we usually think of those as being backwards, like the physical structures are more real, but I think we're starting to see, as some of these things break down, that the information map is maybe the real map, or at least is just as real.
Look at the crisis that we're having right now. We've got this war with Iran, and public discourse is like, what are the objectives? Why are we even having this war? It doesn't make any sense.
People are looking for a map that explain it.
Right. And so what we have is really a failure in this meaning layer in our culture. If we look at that transaction, this war, it lacks clear meaning. It's nonsensical. It's like, why are we doing this? It doesn't even make sense to a lot of people. Now, some people are going to be like, it makes sense to them, but broadly, and we're starting to see this around the world, people are like, this doesn't make any sense. We're not on board with this. This is crazy. But here's the problem that we're running into. We don't actually have a replacement map. That's fundamentally the problem. And kind of what I'm postulating in this paper is, hey, now that we have AI, now that we have these LLMs that have essentially mapped the body of human knowledge, they can elucidate some of the structures of meaning. Like, we can use that as a reference tool to say, hey, okay, we want to reconcile with the Iranians. Let's try to understand where they're really coming from. They have a different worldview, and they're living. We go back to the landscape. We're living in our little valley of meaning. Okay, we got the moral high ground over here. We got wells of wisdom. We use landscape words to define meaning.
Define the path forward.
Yes. So we're literally living in this landscape of meaning. And we all, like you and I, will look around and like, okay, we see the same things and we interpret it the same ways. But over the ridge, there's another valley. Let's say the Iranians. They live in a very different world of meaning. Okay. We know that, but we don't know what that really is. Maybe a few people do, but
So, okay, so we need to get to like how we're going to bridge this, and I want to come back to AI, but I do want to really highlight something you've said about this sense that the map of meaning is collapsing, because I think that's a subjective experience that a lot of people identify with, isn't it?
yes, I mean, I think at this point, everybody has their own internal map, right? There's probably half a dozen issues that you and I, we know each other fairly well. We're going to see those differently. Right? So, like, my map is slightly different than your map, but it's still mostly the same, right? But I think what's happened now is, as people live in little corners of their landscape, they're actually like becoming separated from, like, our valley is turning into valleys. We have separate basins of meaning. Like, you might have like one that's kind of urban educated, you might have a rural, Christian one. You might have different, like Minneapolis, which has been in the news lately. Their immigrant population, has a different set of meanings that they
People
follow.
predicted this, like at the start of the internet era, that this would accelerate the balkanization of meaning map. But I think there's another thing in play here. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, and that is that I I think we've kind of lost the ability to see maps of meaning and understand their role, or maybe we've downplayed their role. Or you could even say that a large part of the social progress of the last century is getting rid of maps of meaning. Is that does that resonate? Like, and that puts us in a difficult or a different place when they are collapsing. If we've lost our ability to see them, share them, talk about them, value them, reinforce them. So you're kind of trying to bring back maybe some ways of talking about it. But first, like, do you agree with that? That
I do.
we're essentially like have gotten rid of some of these tools.
I think it's progression. We talked about this last time, and I think society is a movement and it's a cycle. So every society is going to go through this. But I think recently we've gotten to the place, and maybe it's capitalism is to blame, that marketing has figured out that in order to get the maximum value out of the consumers, they will affirm that person's beliefs and create an affinity, whatever their could be a religious brand, it could be like a consumer brand, but it's basically like, hey, the more that we can cause these people to identify with us, and part of that is differentiating themselves from other people, then the stronger hold that we have over that consumer.
So Black Rifle Coffee, identifying with gun culture, right wing, pro veteran of Dove's campaigns a few years ago, going in on body image and and just basically weighing in with their product on how you should feel about being a woman and about beauty and about your body. And so, like, by aligning, we can sell stuff. By aligning with the map that somebody has, what we think that they have, we can sell stuff better. Is that good or bad?
It just is.
Just is.
I think it's just a natural progression of how societies evolve. And what it has led to is exactly what you said. It's a balkanization of meaning that, now I don't know how you experience it, but like when I was young, it was pretty common for people to be able to sit around the dinner table. I remember this as a child and have conversations about social issues that were cordial and polite and constructive. Now those lines of differences have been so accentuated, and this goes into politics and religion and all of these different areas of the society, that a lot of these positions become difficult for us to navigate from one basin of meaning to the other.
So we talk about it being social trust being eroded. Again, we're using a landscape term.
Exactly, yes.
Like, instead of being a gentle valley and saddles into other basins, we're kind of in canyons and chasms, and it's really hard to get over.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, if you take your traditional, like, Southern Christian basin or valley of meaning over here, and there used to be roads and bridges that would go to other places. But like you're saying, those are increasingly eroded. And some of those, I mean, a lot of that is, in a sense, I'm comfortable here. I want to protect my little Garden of Eden where I feel very happy, metaphysically, and I'm not challenged. And this is a nice, happy place for me. I want to protect it. I don't want people coming through here. I don't want challenging ideas to disrupt anything. So we probably are responsible for that erosion. One of the points that I'm making in my paper, we are changing those landscapes.
Right.
I mean, just look at the landscape of gender, like one of the most fundamental human constructs that has changed massively. And what used to be something that was largely kind of a similar concept, now you have some very, very strong and different opinions on that. So they,
People are not just at different places in the same map; they're actually inhabiting different maps.
right, and you see that some of the contention in society around these issues.
Mhm. So seems like a lot of gloom and doom, but you do talk very constructively about how bridges happen between different basins, how landscapes are constructed, some of the better practices for making things happen.
What I was proposing in my paper, and again, we've got to be careful because when you're talking about using an LLM as a simulation to map meaning, as it
Yeah,
were.
I'm very suspicious of that, but
Yeah, well, there's obviously conversations to be had around that, but we're talking on some levels of abstraction there.
you're using it as a metaphor, right?
Yes,
Because maybe some people, not everybody, but some people sort of understand how LLMs work. And there
yes,
is an inference machine
yes,
that creates a web of connections. So it's a way of jolting us out of this idea that everything is mechanically connection in a
yeah.
Cartesian-Newtonian way. And yeah, so if you like, well, think like an LLM is a suggestion that I think is fruitful.
Well, I think what it allows us to do, Aram, is once we can, in a sense, map it or define a thought,
Mhm.
we can compare that with, let's just say, let's talk about the idea of peace. We can talk about peace. If we had an American LLM, we say, okay, we're going to put this in, we're going to see what peace looks like in the American mind,
Right.
and we're going to put it in an Iranian LLM, and we're going to see what it means to them. And we're probably going to find, and we have very different meanings around that. I mean, frankly, our definition is like, we need to retain our, forgive me, but our sense of ego. We need to win. The US doesn't lose, so we need to get this. And the Iranians are going to have a very, like, we just want to be left alone. Like, we don't, anyway, there's subtle differences that are in those fields of meaning or those shapes of meaning that are not apparent when we talk. And I think, so part of it is LLMs open up a technique that we could leverage to essentially measure the difference in meaning.
Or are you just describing what we would have normally expected of a mediator
Hmm.
or what we would have traditionally called wisdom? Yes.
But it also, when you think about meaning as a landscape, it's a really profound shift in how we're defining it. Because if we look at the progression of Western society, we came out of, the religious worldview, which is where our universities and our kind of knowledge institutions came out of biblical truths. And then that kind of morphed into scientific truth, which is, the idea that there's one truth about things that science is going to elucidate. And so we're still stuck in this way of thinking of basically right and wrong, you know, like this whole situation in Iran. Why are we fighting a war? If it's a war to determine who's right and who's wrong, somebody's going to take the blame for this in our current mindset. When we talk about landscapes, that whole kind of paradigm shifts. We're talking about ecosystems. That's what we're talking about.
I think this is a very traditional way of looking at things. Like this whole Aquinas, Descartes, Newton trajectory is the modern way of thinking about things. But in an ancient worldview, it's exactly like you're saying, like concept isn't a single thing. It's part of this complex web with complements and opposites
Mhm.
and attractors and everything in life exists within this web. I would say that really is a traditional
Yes.
way of looking at the world. And so I think can also be a very modern or fit for the future. But in some ways, it doesn't need to stand in opposition to people who feel like they need to have a home with ancient ways of thinking.
Right. And so it kind of sets us up for shifting thinking. Like, we saw Rachel Carlson's work. Silent Spring was a critique of the idea of monoculture. And, like we know that we both have been in Africa for a while. The West was going in there and saying, we're going to teach you how to farm. And, you do it our way and you'll get the best results. And that didn't work out because ecosystems matter. In a sense, our thought life is shaped by our ecosystem that we live in. And each ecosystem has its merits. This is why we don't want habitat loss in the natural world, because when we lose diversity, we're losing resources. But we haven't translated that thinking into worldviews. Like there's still this kind of tacit assumption that, one worldview is better. What we're getting to when we're mapping meaning is like this worldview, these are its strengths, these are its weaknesses, these are its taboos, and then it sits next to this one. And we can start looking at, instead of which one of these two competing things is going to win, it's like, what can each bring to the table? How can we negotiate some of the sticking points between these two worldviews? How can we negotiate that?
So Samuel Huntington kind of took this zero-sum approach. And, there's some truth to that, right? There are clashes between civilizations, but then there's also relationships between different topographies and between different basins. In your paper, you talked a fair bit about attractors. And I think that's a really interesting concept. Can you explain what that is or what that would be in this context?
I think there are these fundamental ideas that different cultures, which you would liken to different valleys in the landscape of thought, they have different attractors. So, for example, the Western culture has a strong rights attractor. Like any topic that we want to talk about, we're going to interpret it through the lens of rights. Go to, and autonomy and there are related ideas like this. You go to another culture and they may see that same narrative interpreted through the lens of responsibility. If you go to the Indian subcontinent, strong family responsibilities there versus our kids get to be 18 and they're like, I'm out of here, right? So the attractors are those fundamental concepts in the culture that tend to pull all the other topics towards it. Democracy, freedom, whatever they are. Other cultures have different ones, and those are the strong attractors that tend to define the culture.
And there are a lot of them, and they operate simultaneously. It's not like you're choosing one or the other. It's more that you're in a high-dimensional space with a whole bunch of different attractors, and it's hard to think of a three-dimensional topography. It's in many dimensions and numerous dimensions, but you can do it. You can do math.
Yes.
With that kind of layout. That's basically what we're saying. And so you can point at a tractor over there and say, hey, see how this is influencing. It has a gravitational pull that pulls words toward it. It pulls family behaviors toward it. It pushes away something that's a compliment or something like that.
Right.
So can you sort of high level describe some of the things that you feel like are important in the phase that we're moving into, however you want to describe it, post-liberal or post-postmodern or after the breakdown of the topographies? What are some of the attractors that you're seeing playing a big role in the next phase? Like you're not defining the future, but what are the attractors?
I would say the first part of that is recognizing that our map is broken. That's the first part. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people are there, and they will continue to try to go to the old ideas, even though they're not working. I mean, we can just look broadly across our society and say, there's a lot of things that aren't working. But once we start to shift into talking about what is emergent, obviously we've gone to a multipolar world. That's what this big geopolitical struggle is essentially playing out right now. We went from basically pre-World War II, there was a global order. Post-World War II, there was the two superpowers, then to a binary system to a singular system where the US was the only superpower, and it became a hegemon. And that has caused an awakening around the idea of a multipolar world order. So we're seeing that as a shift.
Yeah, that's right.
And we see that same line of thought like playing out in other areas of society. For example, in psychology, a lot of psychology started to go to spectrum disorders. Like things aren't clearly defined. Things could be much more spread out, as it were. So there's shifts in thinking. So I'd say a multipolar world is one thing that starts to bring into question the singularity of truth. That basically says there might be multiple ways to see this, which is a shift in thinking. For a long time, it's just been the West telling the rest of the world, this is how you need to run your country. It needs to be a democracy.
Well, it's part of the Descartes thing, right? Either it is or it isn't. It's not everywhere. It's at a place versus everything exists in a web. And if everything exists in this web, then you can have a singular point or singular points that that pull it together or unify it or where it vanishes. I agree. I think that's becoming a little more clear. Some people see that in positive terms versus negative terms.
And then I would say another, and this kind of goes back to some of my work on the quantum worldview, but once you start to get to that situation in your mind where like there may be multiple truths here or multiple perspectives that these people feel are true, that then becomes acceptance of paradox in society. And I think that's a major shift in how the world can be viewed. So, for example, we would view law enforcement as the good, and we use the criminals as evil. But in fact, they have a symbiotic relationship, right? You need the law to define who's criminal, but you need the criminals to justify the existence of the law. So here we move from this, like there's only one correct way in society to do this.
You have rules. You need to know who's in, who's out. Actually, they're both manifestations of the same thing, which is there's a variation in human behavior, and there's an ideal that a society selects, and then it pushes it down to the layers of abstraction until it becomes a rule. And even the rule is never quite absolute. It has to be sort of reified on the street by the criminals and the police officers.
Right.
Are playing different roles in order to sort of pull this abstraction down from where it lives as an ideal of truth or justice or honesty or whatever it is.
And I think this is where we can shift some things in our culture, because again, who's driving, for example, the drug trade? It's everyday people in this country. Now, these are the same people that are saying, it's wrong. A lot of our lifetime, we've had the war on drugs. So there's literally been a war around this topic while those people that we're at war with are serving our society, their wants and needs, right? So there's a paradox there. We don't have the structural elements in our worldview to process that paradox. So we just continue to, proceed with this war while we're driving the consumer market for the goods.
I mean, you can use paradox or you could use mystery, but really it's what you're saying, that we've come to see the world as a mechanical thing, or hope or assume that it can be pushed into something mechanical. And that's a really odd way to look at the world. The world is really complicated. To try to put things in categories and create mechanical connections between them is not normal. It's not how perceptions work. It's not how families work. It's not how neighborhoods work. It's not how your garden works, right? And so these new attractors of paradox, history, spirituality, quantum relationships, topologies, those, I think in many ways, they feel strange to us modern people, but they're not strange at all.
Because we've become an advanced society, we have looked at, you could say, advanced aspects of nature, science, basically, physics, and we were like, oh, this is really cool.
Sure. Yeah.
Physics is a determinate system. So, let's think about humanity, in the Dark Ages.
Which it turns out it isn't.
Right. Well, yes, we'll get to that.
Okay, yeah, but Newtonian physics is determinate.
Yeah.
So then we import that metaphor into things where that is not how things work at all.
And so, like, as a world, we went from this place where the world is mysterious and we not understandable, and we don't want to go into the forest because there are demons there, and we were very constrained by mystery. And then as we started to practice this new way of thinking, we're like, oh, now we can do all of these new things. And what a lot of people don't realize is that way of thinking, it's not being confined to science. If you go to the university here, the management department's called the Department of Management Science. And you and I, because we're businessmen, we know a lot of what we do is kind of like science stuff. We're going to measure the metric, we're going to track the data. And so even parts of our society that are scientific have been reshaped into a scientific mindset. And it's super effective. We know this from business, right? Like,
it's effective at a certain level. Just like Newtonian physics is effective, between here and here, these levels of scale.
Yes.
It's effective at certain levels of scale and under certain circumstances. That's part of what's breaking down, is that our businesses, first of all, it's not true. That's not how everything operates.
Right.
Just like you can't build a chip and store your thumb drive and store your data on it unless you know how quantum fields work.
That's right.
You can't actually run a business unless you know things other than the mechanicals of running a business.
So we discovered this very productive domain of thought.
It's very productive. Yes.
And this is, look at our society.
Look at where we're sitting. Like
Yeah,
all
we're surrounded by this
gadgets that are
amazing
around us.
technology that even as a kid, I could never have imagined this. So we found this very productive things, but it's only productive in that certain domain.
Right.
And what ends up happening as we started to have more and more mastery of the things that are within that domain, the things outside of that domain have become more and more the drivers of the things that we don't understand.
Okay, that's really important. I would say it's not just the drivers of things that we don't understand, but they become the determinants, not in a sense of determinacy, but okay, if everything inside your system is controlled by a certain paradigm, it's taken for granted or it's a premise.
Mhm.
And so then everything outside of your system is what produces actual change, actual result, actual surprise, right? There's no information left in a determinate system. But increasingly, we're finding that all of the things that are interesting that are happening are coming from outside the system. We're like, what the fuck? Why is this here? It's not supposed to exist at
Right.
all. It should tell you that your topology, your meaning that you live in isn't working for you.
And then there are numerous things that happen when you have that mindset, like people engage in this activity to get the maximum margin out of their investments, as it were. And so they're often trading off resilience for efficiency, because resilience is there to deal with indeterminate events, right? So when we have our whole mindset that we've got this all covered out, we don't need to spend the money and the time dealing with things that are not going to happen. We can just engineer that out of our purview. Then obviously when those things happen, they're much more damaging to us. So it's not apparent, when you start thinking about it, but the shift in thinking is profound. And a lot of what we're dealing with now, COVID, this whole war, which is being very irrationally driven, it's not those deterministic things. It's the indeterminacy. How is AI playing out on the battlefield? We don't know. It's an indeterminate question, right? So there's indeterminacy now is the problem of our age, and we're trying to solve that problem with deterministic thinking. And that doesn't work. Where can you find the inspiration for a new worldview to deal with those indeterminate problems? You can look to quantum physics, because that is a system that deals with chaos and indeterminacy. Okay, so we can draw inspiration from that. Or, we can look at this idea of mapping meaning. That is a probabilistic model. And when you say that, that is inclusive of all outcomes. So a probabilistic model is kind of taking up the space between determinacy and indeterminacy. You have the deterministic element. The most probable is in that model, but also the least probable is in that model. So I think when we shift our, in a sense, our core paradigms to some of these models of thinking that are more accommodating of indeterminacy, that starts to unlock different perspectives, new techniques and approaches that we can use to solve real problems that we're having.
Yeah, it just is not first nature for us, because we want things to behave like a machine, and that's how we build our world.
Yes.
So then to say, well, you need to be working on meaning, or you need to look at the things that are unlikely, whatever that sort of beyond the edge of our epistemology, that's really difficult for people.
Well, and I think too, the challenge that we have as human beings, I mean, we can be very smart. Obviously, we do amazing things, but on average, the average human being is not great at dealing with tremendous complexity.
True,
right?
true.
So yes, you might have a specialty in microprocessor design or something, but in general, in terms of all the complexity in the world, individually, we don't have the faculties to navigate all the complexity that now we are running into. And so we tend to favor these simplistic models.
Sure.
Because in the end, they're more useful to us.
Right.
Imagine you can have a very simple map with just the streets on it, or you could have I'm very familiar with ArcGIS, which is the company that does all the mapping, the 800-pound gorilla of the mapping world. They have 1,000 layers of data in their map, right? You don't want to be driving down the interstate with ArcGIS on your car navigation, because it would be too much information. You want the simple information, you want the simple paradigm because it's easy to navigate. But when you're in a complex environment, it's not helping you. And I think that's where we are.
Constantly moving back and forth between specificity and generalizations, making things simpler, making them more detailed. That's part of how life works, part of how eyesight works, how perception and thought works, how computers work.
Yeah, and even so, I think one of the really great things about AI and LLMs is it's helped us progress our thinking on how the human brain works. Because what we have tended to do as a society is we see the brain behaving in the same way that we do. So like for a while, I think humanity thought like our brain records things like we'd write it down on a piece of paper. And then, you've seen it in the legal system. For a while, people thought our brain records information like VHS tapes, and then someone would be on trial. And what did you see? And the fact that they didn't see it proved that it didn't happen. And now we've progressed to the point where it's like, that's not how the brain works. The brain is doing a lot of managing of the complexity behind the scenes. It's filtering what you see. It doesn't record everything what you see. It records what's poignant, or there's a lot of complexity around neuroscience. But here, now we have a tool that allows us to basically model that complexity.
Well, it is sort of front and center. And so it's forcing people or encouraging people to think more critically about thinking and ask questions. What is the human mind or the human being that's outside of calculation? Because now we have a machine that's doing something that's outside of calculation in a sense, right? So it's helping us ask some really interesting questions. I think you're right. That opens up then possibilities for people to start thinking about thinking in new ways.
Yes, it's almost like now we have a microscope looking into our conscious thought, or simulating it.
We're attempting to make it simulated, and through that, we're understanding better what it's simulating or not.
Or we could say a telescope that's looking at the collective, our collective consciousness. These LLMs are trained on everything, basically, all information. So it's giving us a perspective that as an individual, I would never be able to have.
Right.
So it's almost now collectively we're able to see things about ourselves that before was simply intuition. Now we can compute those things. And that leads to all kinds of, the revolution in consciousness that could lead to, I'm not saying AI doing stuff for us, but just the fact that now we have a way to reflect on our own consciousness could be a really profound shift in how we behave socially.
Well, look, it's accelerated what we've been talking about this whole time with our maps of meaning failing. And so we're looking beyond the edge to, what is the part of meaning that hasn't collapsed yet? So the fact that we have this sort of mirror or lens in LLMs to see aspects of ourselves, I think it's accelerating people's consciousness about consciousness, for example, just the way writing does that. Conversation does that. Writing something down and looking at it a year later, like that becomes a sort of mirror. And in some profound ways, I think artificial intelligence is encouraging people to say, wait, what is a human again? What does it do?
Right.
Because I thought I understood it, but I clearly don't, because this thing is happening and it's happening in here.
Yes.
And it elucidates what's going on.
Yeah.
So I think that's an example maybe of what you talked about as bridge ideas or structurally critical ideas. Can you explain what those are?
Well, if we again, we go to the assumption that meaning creates landscapes and different cultures inhabit different landscapes. Well, let's say we have the US landscape, we have the Iranian landscape. There are these mountains, in a sense, that divide us. We're on our moral high ground over here, looking down on them. But in a sense, the transition points, like a mountain pass between valleys, those can be engineered.
We can do thought. We can build those connections, and we can recognize them and shine lights on them.
We can look for ways that in the ideal landscape, we can say, hey, this piece of our landscape over here makes a nice transition to that piece of their landscape. And we just have to do a little bit of kind of mutual work to bridge that. Okay. And so it could be, I don't want to speculate about what those can be, but it's like once we start to map the landscape, we can see where those saddles and the ridges may occur. Like maybe there's this piece of our belief system where there is no way for for somebody to traverse over those things and end up in their worldview. They're incompatible with connection.
Well, let's speculate a little bit, because that's essentially what Coherent Business Podcast is about. It's providing structurally critical ideas, like helping people find the saddle into another view of business or another view of the corporation even. Are there any of those that you've been thinking about that we would specifically apply to the business situation and helping us see how we get from here to there? Because I have a sense that where we are now is unsustainable in so many different ways.
Well, this key on that word sustainable, I think ultimately, I would say the sustainable business is part of this new mode of thinking. Okay.
Sure.
I think what we've seen in business is a history of unsustainable businesses that grow, explode, and then collapse. So many of them over my lifetime. But sustainable businesses are going to have some different characteristics. I mentioned this just a minute ago. Like, efficiency is not sustainable. It's maximally productive, but it's not going to be around for the long haul, because eventually something is going to come along that's going to be outside of the parameters that you run for the most efficient populations. If you take efficiency, we would say we want to maximize this variable, maximum profit. Let's take that as a Ferrari that you want to drive fast. The goal is let's go as fast as we can. Well, that's fine if you're on a racetrack. The variable of what you're driving on never change. But out in the real world, you can get hung up on a speed bump. You could hit a rock with your tire and it will pop because they're like an inch thick or whatever. A more resilient choice would be a more practical view, a truck or something, and that's resilient and it can handle the changing landscapes that you have to traverse.
Can corporations do that when they're in a competitive landscape, they're running races with Ferraris?
This is the crux of where the idea meets the person. Somebody has to say, in the long run, this is the best choice. And you will deal with the trade-off every day until that black swan event comes along. And all those people who were running their competitive businesses and they were making more profit, blah, 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 they go out of business. Strategic thinking is long-term thinking.
Yeah.
If you're running your engine at redline all the time, trying to get the most out of your machine, at some point, something's going to go wrong.
Well, this efficiency resilience trade-off is sort of one kind of micro example, but it also has to do with just how complex of a landscape you're living in.
Yes. I think if we say the ecosystem resides in the landscape, we live in very complex ecosystems. And like in business, what we've seen is coming back to bite us in the butt as a nation is we've been driven by efficiency for the last, 20, 30 years, and everything, all our manufacturing was outsourced, and hey, we can make it in China for a quarter of the price, blah, blah, blah. We've seen all of that, the movement towards maximized efficiency, and now we have no resiliency. And so now we're in this position like up a creek without a paddle, because I don't know, we made those choices, we made those trade-offs for the short-term gain. And now how do we find resiliency in our economy? I don't know that we do, or it'll be very painful.
Yeah. Well, I think to make something like that happen, what you have to do is you have to tap into useful relationships with more parts of your ecosystem, so that the world that you're living in, it's not just the world you're living in is more complex, the world you're aware of is more complex, but more points of that complexity are built into your business model. So the triple bottom line is like a really crass way of talking about this, but it's still a very simple mechanistic model which accepts all of the same constraints that we're living with.
Right.
And, some of the really most advanced leaders then incorporate a million more data points into how they run the business. A lot of the really good ones do that. It's not uncommon at all, but you can't just trade off efficiency against resilience on a single continuum. I guess what I'm trying to say is you have to learn how to live within that multiplex landscape so that you're a part of an ecology rather than a mining company or something.
Yeah, and I think what ends up happening is you get a shift in the vision of what's possible. We still tend in our Western business mind, it's like, we're going to grow this company and we're going to be the biggest in the world. It's still a very prominent way of people thinking. It's like, we're just going to maximize this. And I think when you start to look at domains, landscapes, etc., you have to start dealing with locality. In the end, ecosystems existed in a space.
Yeah.
And the way that we've currently constructed our world is we have pieces that are essential to our operations that are existing in different ecosystems that we don't agree with. It's like Iran has the oil. That's a whole different ecosystem of thought. And we're having a conflict around ideas with them, because we see the world differently, but we're still dependent on them.
It actually means that we depend on them being controlled by us insofar as certain economic interests go.
Yeah, and that's been the mindset. Like we want
It's
to
the
control them.
domination versus stewardship thing that you talked about.
Right. And obviously it's not working.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's a short-term game. I mean, we dominated them for decades. But
sort of. It's Persian. They've been around a long time. Those probably for another long time.
But they have a different worldview that allows them to play the long game. I mean, any seasoned statesman should know that. I mean, like we're pursuing this whole like avenue of geopolitical relations with China, and that's an ancient civilization. They're playing the long game, and we're playing the short game because we have that Cartesian-Newtonian mindset. It's like we just want to reach our goal. Trump saying that we won the war in Iran, right? It's like we want to accomplish it, and then we're done, and we're going to move on to our next.
Yeah, we want simple stories. Like you're saying, that's how we think. But we're entering a time where finding maps of meaning is what is going to carry the day, or where the critical edge of growth is going to be. So I think that's what you're trying to get at in your paper is let's pay attention to how very complex meaning actually emerges and see if we can get better at it.
Yeah, it's basically like, look, we're going to have a relationship with Iran one way or the other because they're a major oil supplier. So why not shift our thinking towards an ecology that says, yes, they're different than us, but we can find bridges between our culture and that culture where it's not a problem, which is the traditional role of diplomacy, but we've seems to have lost that.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say in closing?
I think the reason I wrote this paper, Aram, is we're at a kind of an inflection point in our culture, in our society, a crisis, if you want to call it that. And I mean, it was Einstein said, we can't solve the problems with the same level of thinking that got us there.
Yeah.
So really what I was saying with this paper is now that we have some new tools to evaluate meaning, collective consciousness, and things like that, I think it would be very smart to put together a team that can start working on this. I mean, it's very experimental. I don't have the answers, but there is clearly a path there. There's an opportunity there. So it's almost, I think this is an opportunity for our culture now to, instead of letting the technocrats continue with the same behavior that has got us into this situation, we can have a civic discussion around some of these topics. And as a collective society, say, look, we're going to define meaning moving forward. This does not need to be done for us. This is our responsibility in our culture to define meaning for a changing time. So that's really what I was saying in this paper. So if any of your listeners are interested in that, they can reach out to you. We can talk.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of my listeners are interested in that. I'm hoping that this conversation helps them to see that. Both my clients and a lot of people listening to the show, they are asking this question, right? I know I don't live in a mechanistic universe. I know that my life is complex. I know I need to create meaning. I know I need to, make decisions based on data that isn't within the data set that is given to me in an MBA. And so I can help them do that, but what you've done here in this paper is help us develop some of the framework that I think maybe a lot of people will be able to grab onto and understand. So, good stuff.